The blizzard howled furiously outside, its frozen gusts hammering against the walls of Michael's cabin. Inside, the retired firefighter lounged in his living room, bathed in the warm, flickering light from the fireplace. For days, the storm had cut him off from the world, and the only sounds were the occasional snaps from the burning logs. Suddenly, a soft, urgent scratching cut through the quiet. Michael's brow furrowed as he put his coffee mug aside. Straining his ears, he heard it again, this time with a faint whine. Rising from his seat, his pulse quickened. The noise was emanating from the front door. Advancing cautiously toward the doorway, Michael's eyes widened in disbelief as he neared the glass door. Through the wild swirl of snow, a German shepherd stood shivering, her frame shaking from the cold. Clinging closely to her were two small puppies, almost hidden under her protective form. Ice adorned her coat, and her breaths formed visible clouds as she looked up at Michael with eyes brimming with desperation. Michael paused, his hand just inches from the doorknob. He realized that opening the door might invite risk into his sanctuary. Yet as her pleading eyes met his, a profound empathy welled up inside him. The choice he was on the cusp of making could alter their fates irrevocably. Heart racing, Michael stood motionless before the door, the storm howling around the shuddering form of the German shepherd. Her breath misted the cold glass as she hunched protectively over her pups, their tiny bodies nearly engulfed by the mounting snow. Michael noted her ribs visible through the sparse fur, her coat clumped with frost, and her eyes, intense with fear, yet hopeful, fixed steadfastly on him. "What in the world happened to you?" Michael murmured under his breath, his words forming a mist in the chilly air of the cabin. Without thinking, he reached for the doorknob. As he cracked the door open, a blast of icy wind burst into the cabin, bringing with it the biting cold of the storm. The German shepherd stood her ground, her paws embedded in the snow. She remained immobile, her eyes locked on Michael, filled with uncertainty and doubt. "Come inside, girl. Come on," Michael encouraged softly, bending down to appear less threatening. "You won't survive out there." With a gentle whimper, the dog cast a wary glance at her puppies before she cautiously moved forward. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, urging it to follow her. The smaller pup faltered in the snow, its tiny legs flailing. The mother swiftly scooped it up by the scruff and carried it into the cabin, the other pup trailing behind. Once they were all inside, Michael quickly closed the door, silencing the howling wind. The warmth of the cabin made the German shepherd shudder even more, her body trying to acclimate to the sudden change in temperature. Michael fetched an old blanket from the sofa and tenderly covered her and the pups with it. She twitched initially, but as she realized Michael meant no harm, she relaxed, exhaling a long, tremulous sigh, and settled down by the fire, encircling her puppies protectively. Michael knelt by her side, his thoughts racing. The puppies were tiny, their eyes barely open, their fragile bodies evident as their small chests heaved with each strained breath. He reached out gently towards one, but the mother's soft growl halted him. It wasn't aggressive, merely a caution, her way of maintaining a protective barrier between them. All right," Michael whispered, pulling his hands back in a gesture of peace. "I understand. You're doing an incredible job. You've had a tough time, haven't you?" He got up and fetched a bowl from the kitchen, filled it with warm water, and set it down near the dog. Taking a step back to respect her space, Michael watched as she warily eyed him and then slowly began to drink, her pups nestled tightly by her side. Observing from afar, Michael's mind was awash with questions. Where had she come from? How did she end up in the thick of a blizzard with her newborns? Her condition hinted at prolonged solitude, enough to weaken her but not defeat her. That she had navigated the storm with her young was nothing less than miraculous. But what now? Michael's retirement had been peaceful and solitary. He hadn't cared for a pet in years. The prospect of suddenly nurturing 3 dogs, especially in such desperate circumstances, seemed daunting. Yet, as he watched the weary mother curling around her pups, his resolve firmed. He knew he couldn't just turn them away. "You really are a fighter, aren't you?" Michael remarked in a gentle voice. "Looks like you're not the only one." As the evening stretched on, Michael busied himself with making the trio more comfortable. He spread towels for the puppies to rest on, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and kept the fireplace burning to warm the room. The German Shepherd monitored him intently, her eyes following each of his actions. Yet, as time passed, she began to unwind. Eventually, she allowed her head to settle onto the blanket, her eyes gradually closing in rest. Seated in his chair with the fire softly crackling beside him, Michael felt an unexpected sense of purpose wash over him. He couldn't predict what the next day might hold, but he knew he had done everything possible for the moment. And as the blizzard continued to howl outside, he silently vowed to the mother and her pups they were now safe, and he would ensure no harm came to them. The next morning, Michael was gently roused by the sound of soft whimpers and the subdued crackling of the fire that had dwindled overnight. The storm had abated, leaving a serene landscape blanketed in snow that sparkled under the early morning sun. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Michael's thoughts quickly turned to the unexpected guest sheltering in his home. Glancing towards the fireplace, he saw the German Shepherd still nestled protectively around her pups. The little ones twitched and wriggled beneath her watchful embrace. As Michael shifted in his seat, the mother's ears perked up, and her amber eyes flicked open, meeting his gaze. Though her look was still cautious, the raw desperation of the previous night had eased, replaced by a tentative awareness of her new surroundings. "Good morning, girl," Michael greeted softly as he stretched his limbs and headed towards the kitchen. "Let's find you something to eat." He searched through his pantry and found a can of chicken soup. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for now. After warming the soup on the stove, Michael carefully set a bowl down near her. The German Shepherd raised her head, sniffing the air tentatively, and then began to eat slowly. Her pups, roused by their mother's movement, whimpered softly and nudged closer to her for warmth. Michael knelt a few feet away, watching her feed. "You're incredibly strong," he murmured. "To carry those little ones through such a storm, you deserve so much more than this." As the morning progressed, Michael carefully observed their condition. The mother was clearly underfed, her ribs pronounced against her gaunt frame. The puppies, though weak, displayed a spirited will to survive, their small tails wagging faintly as they nursed. The sight tugged at Michael's heartstrings. His years as a firefighter had exposed him to many forms of suffering, but the silent endurance of these creatures struck a deep chord within him. Resolved to do more, Michael promptly made a call to the nearest veterinary clinic, hoping to secure the necessary care for his newfound charges. "Hey, this is Michael Carter," he introduced himself as the receptionist picked up the phone. "I have a German Shepherd and her 2 puppies here. They're not in good shape. Can you take a look at them?" The receptionist responded with a tone that was both warm and professional. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We can fit you in this afternoon. Bring them over and we'll see what we can do." Michael ended the call feeling a surge of relief. He turned to look at the German Shepherd who was now gently grooming her puppies, her actions reflecting her deep maternal care despite her evident weariness. "You hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help," Michael told her, a reassuring smile spreading across his face. Transporting them to the veterinary clinic was a challenge in itself. Michael laid out an old blanket and gently tried to encourage the mother onto it. She resisted, her muscles taut, emitting a soft growl whenever Michael came too close to her puppies. "It's okay," he soothed, keeping his actions deliberate and slow. "I'm not going to hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of patient persuasion, she finally allowed Michael to carefully lift her and the puppies into the back of his truck. He meticulously arranged the blanket to ensure they were snug and secure before setting off toward town. The roads remained slick with ice from the storm, prompting Michael to drive with extra caution, his thoughts swirling with concerns. Where had she come from? Was there someone out there missing her? Or had she been cruelly abandoned to survive the harsh winter alone? Upon their arrival at the vet clinic, the staff sprang into action, efficiently examining the mother and her pups. "Her weight is dangerously low," noted Dr. Monroe as she examined the dog's gaunt body. "However, she's tough. Her puppies are fortunate she survived this long." She gave Michael a meaningful look. "She has endured quite a bit. Recovery will be slow, but she can heal with the right treatment. Do you have any idea of her origins?" Michael shook his head. "She appeared on my doorstep just last night. I couldn't just let her stay outside." Dr. Monroe offered a gentle smile. She definitely picked the right door to come to. When Michael returned home with them, the mother dog seemed more at peace. Her puppies, filled with food from the clinic, squirmed joyfully as they snuggled up against her. Michael sat close by, observing as the German Shepherd finally started to unwind. She even allowed him to come nearer, her gaze softening as he gently caressed her head. "You're safe now," Michael whispered, his voice laden with emotion. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but you can stay here as long as you need." For the first time, the German Shepherd pressed into his hand, her body easing its tension. A lump formed in Michael's throat. He had let her in on a whim, unsure of what would follow, but now, witnessing her burgeoning trust, he understood that they had both discovered something previously lost, a shared purpose and possibly a new beginning. In the ensuing days, a steady pattern of healing and bonding unfolded. The German Shepherd, now named Grace by Michael, gradually regained her vitality. Her eyes, once dull, started to gleam with vitality, and her puppies, named Snow and Ash, became livelier each day. Michael would spend hours on the floor by the fireplace, allowing Grace to get used to him. Initially, she eyed him warily, her posture stiff and guarded, but as time passed, her defenses slowly started to lower. She began to tolerate his proximity, her growls turning into soft exhales, and eventually, she even allowed his strokes without pulling back. One windy night, Michael leaned against the couch on the floor, mesmerized by the flickering flames. Grace was close by, her head on her paws, watching Snow and Ash playfully tumble around, their little tails energetically waving. Michael chuckled at their play. "You've got some brave little ones there, Grace," he murmured, glancing at her. She raised her head, her eyes conveying what Michael interpreted as thankfulness. He cautiously extended his hand, brushing her head. To his astonishment, she didn't shrink back but instead leaned into his caress, her body fully easing into the comfort of his touch. As weeks passed, the change in Grace was unmistakable. Her fur, previously dull and sparse, now gleamed with vitality. Her ribs were less pronounced, and her vigor seemed to be replenished, manifesting in lively spurts. She engaged with her puppies, gently pushing them with her snout, observing as they clumsily navigated the cabin, their tiny yelps of joy filling the space. Michael experienced a transformation too. Having spent years in isolation in his cabin, relishing the peaceful seclusion of his post-work life, the arrival of Grace and her litter infused his days with a new vibrancy. The once quiet nights were now lively with the sounds of playful yips and the gentle tread of paws on the wooden floor. He hadn't realized just how much he had missed having a purpose until they came into his life. One sunny afternoon, while Michael was splitting logs outside, he caught sight of Grace peering out the window, her nose pressed firmly against the pane. Below her, Snow and Ash frolicked, their small forms playfully colliding. Michael stopped to wipe the perspiration from his forehead and waved at her. To his delight, Grace responded with a single tail wag, a simple gesture that deeply warmed his heart. When he stepped back inside, Grace was waiting by the door, her tail moving slightly as she pushed her nose against his hand. It was the first time she had approached him on her own, and Michael's face lit up with a broad smile. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" He laughed, crouching down to scratch her behind the ears. Grace pressed closer, her tail now thumping with vigor. Snow and Ash yipped joyously, weaving around his legs. As their connection deepened, Michael found himself pondering over Grace's history. Where had she come from? What had driven her to his doorstep on that snowy evening? These questions hovered in his thoughts, yet one truth was clear. Grace's journey was one of endurance and grit. She had overcome dire straits with her pups at her side. Undoubtedly, she was a survivor. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Michael gazed at Grace and murmured, "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones, you're part of the family now." Grace raised her head, her eyes locking with his. In her look, there was a deep understanding, a connection that transcended words. She exhaled gently and laid her head on his lap. Her body relaxed. For the first time since her arrival, Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he ran his fingers through her fur. He hadn't anticipated how the arrival of a stray dog and her puppies would so deeply affect him. But sitting there, in the warmth of the fire and the quiet sounds of Grace and her pups, he recognized that they had brought him something he hadn't realized was missing: companionship, purpose, and a revived sense of hope. The morning light streamed through the windows of the cabin, bathing the floor in golden hues where snow and ash playfully wrestled. Nearby, Grace reclined, her eyes nearly closed in relaxation, yet her ears twitched at every little noise. Michael stood by the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching them with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Despite the tranquility of the moment, a persistent question tugged at Michael's thoughts. Where had Grace come from? The telltale signs of a tough life were evident: her slender build, the subtle scars marking her fur, and her tentative movements when startled. It was clear someone had let her down, and Michael was haunted by the thought that this person might still be out there. That afternoon, Michael decided it was time for Grace and the pups to get some fresh air. The snow was melting, uncovering the icy earth underneath. Grace stepped out onto the porch cautiously, her nose quivering as she scented the air for any signs of danger. The pups, wobbly on their tiny legs, trailed behind her, their excited yips filling the air as they discovered the world outside the cabin. Michael watched them with a smile. "You're safe now, girl," he whispered. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But as they wandered a bit away from the cabin, Grace stopped abruptly. Her ears perked up, her body tensed, and her nose directed towards the wood's edge. Michael noticed her change in posture and stiffened himself. "What is it?" he murmured, moving closer to her. Grace growled softly, her hackles raised. Michael peered into the trees but saw nothing. Yet Grace's stance, guarded, ready to protect, said it all. There was something out there. He quickly scooped up the pups into his arms and ushered Grace back to the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and drew the curtains, his heart pounding. Grace continued her restless pacing by the window, her gaze repeatedly snapping towards the woods. As evening fell and Michael sat beside the fire, a sense of unease clung to him. Grace lay close by, her puppies huddled against her, yet she remained vigilant, her eyes darting towards the door at each noise. Michael extended his hand and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he whispered. "You've seen something like this before, haven't you?" As he gazed into the fire, his thoughts drifted. He wondered about the hardships Grace must have endured to become so cautious. Was she abandoned? Hurt? Anger tightened his grip. Whoever had mistreated her was unworthy of being called human. Determined to uncover more the next day, Michael loaded Grace and her puppies into his truck and headed to town. The local animal shelter was modest but well-maintained, operated by volunteers familiar with most local animals. At the shelter, Michael approached the front desk with a photo of Grace and her pups in hand. He found her just outside his cabin, he told the receptionist, a compassionate-looking woman in her 40s named Sarah. "I'm trying to find out if she's been reported missing or if you might recognize her." Sarah examined the photograph carefully before shaking her head. "I don't know her," she replied, "but unfortunately we see a lot of dogs like her around here. Many breeders keep them in awful conditions and abandon them when they're no longer of use." A wave of anger washed over Michael. "Are you saying she was just discarded?" Sarah gave a sad nod. "It's more common than you'd imagine, but she's fortunate to have stumbled upon you." The ride back to his cabin was filled with a ponderous quiet. Michael's mind replayed Sarah's words over and over. Grace had been tossed aside, treated as if she were insignificant. But to Michael, she was important. To her pups, to him. He was now resolved to ensure she never felt abandoned again. When they got home, Grace hopped out of the truck and instantly started to sniff the air, her tail giving a tentative wag. Snow and Ash scampered out after her, their tiny legs straining to keep up. Watching them, Michael's heart filled with a mix of rage and hope. "You're safe now," he declared, gazing at Grace. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace looked back at him, her amber eyes softening for the first time. Michael sensed that she really grasped his words, and in that moment, he silently vowed to himself that the person who had hurt her would never have the opportunity to do so again. The days that followed were quietly tense. Grace seemed to unwind a bit more each day, her trust in Michael solidifying. Snow and Ash started to explore the cabin, their youthful curiosity coming alive in playful barks and tumbling antics. Yet, despite the warmth and security of their new home, Michael couldn't shake the eerie feeling that they were being watched. It was a chilly evening when Michael's nagging suspicion was confirmed. He was perched by the window, mindlessly petting Grace while Snow and Ash napped near the crackling fire. Moonlight bathed the snow-blanketed ground outside, throwing elongated shadows across the yard. That's when he spotted it, a silhouette at the forest's edge. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He edged closer to the window, straining his eyes to discern the figure. Shrouded in darkness, the figure was undeniably human, tall and still. They made no sound, simply stood there, their gaze fixed on Grace. "Michael," he murmured softly. The German shepherd's ears twitched, and she turned to see what had caught his attention. As soon as her eyes found the figure, she issued a low, menacing growl, her stance shifting to shield Snow and Ash. Michael swiftly pulled the curtain shut and grabbed his phone, his fingers dialing the local sheriff's number. "This is Michael Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's someone outside my cabin just standing at the edge of the woods. I can't tell who it is, but they've been there for some time." The dispatcher promised that a deputy would be on their way soon, but as Michael hung up, his hand clenched the phone tighter. The situation felt all too intentional, too targeted. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last as Michael waited anxiously. Grace remained stationed by the door, her growls steady and alert, while Michael paced the room, his eyes darting occasionally towards the window. At last, the gleam of headlights cut through the night, and Michael's tension eased somewhat as he saw the deputy's car turn into the driveway. Deputy Miller, a formidable figure with keen eyes, emerged from the vehicle. Michael hurried to meet her at the door, quickly recounting his observation of the mysterious figure at the edge of the woods. He was adamant it wasn't just some random passerby, he declared. They were observing us. Miller gave a nod, her fingers idly touching the holster of her flashlight. "I'll scout the area. Stay indoors and lock up," she instructed. Michael agreed with a nod, feeling a knot of anxiety as he watched her vanish into the forest, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. He remained at the window, fists balled in tension, as Grace sat next to him, her gaze locked on the same distant point, her posture tense. Upon her return, Miller's face was set in a serious line. "It's clear now," she reported, "but I found tracks that lead right up to the border of your land. Someone was definitely spying on this cabin." Michael's throat tightened. "Anything else?" Miller paused, her expression uncertain. "I found a piece of rope tied to a tree. It's worn, but it seems it was used not too long ago. It looks like someone has been using these woods as a makeshift camp." Michael felt a cold shiver run through him. "Do you think they'll return?" "It's hard to tell, Miller answered, "but I'll ensure we have more patrols in this area. Call us right away if you notice anything unusual." After Miller departed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew oppressively tense. Michael secured every entrance, his thoughts spinning. Who was lurking nearby, and what did they want with their secluded cabin, and with Grace? As he sank into the armchair, Grace approached and rested her head against his knee. He gently caressed her fur, his voice a soft murmur. "Don't worry, girl. I won't let anyone hurt you or your pups." Grace whimpered softly, her amber eyes locking with his for the first time since her arrival. In her look, Michael discerned a blend of fear and recognition. She sensed something about the stranger in the woods, something that filled her with dread. That night, Michael found no rest. He remained vigilant by the window, his rifle propped nearby, prepared for any threat. Grace stayed close, her ears perking at each noise. Nearby, Snow and Ash cuddled by the fire, oblivious to the peril outside. As the night wore on, Michael silently pledged to defend Grace and her pups against any danger. They had become his family, and he was determined to safeguard their newfound sanctuary. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the gaps in the curtains, a soft glow spread across the cabin. Michael had spent most of the night awake, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious figure lurking in the woods. Grace had stayed by his side, her body stiff and vigilant, while Snow and Ash continued to sleep peacefully by the fire, unaware of the tension surrounding them. Michael was about to refill his coffee when Grace shot up, dashing to the front door with her ears perked and a deep growl emanating from her throat. Michael's hand paused above the coffee pot. Quickly grabbing his rifle, he tiptoed to the window and cautiously drew back the curtain just enough to see outside. His heart sank. The shadowy figure was back, now closer, standing just off the porch. "Damn it," he whispered. His grip on the rifle tightened as he addressed Grace. "Stay here," though he doubted she would obey. Cracking the door open, Michael stepped onto the frosty porch. "Who's out there?" he called out, managing to keep his voice calm despite his inner turmoil. "You're on private property." Initially, the figure remained still. Then it stepped forward, revealing a man in his 40s, his face partly concealed under the hood of a worn micollet, holding a rope in one hand and wearing a sly smirk. "That's my dog," the man declared, his voice eerily calm yet tinged with a threatening undertone. "I've been searching for her." Michael felt a chill shoot through him. "Your dog?" he questioned, disbelief edging his voice. "She came to my door, nearly dead, with 2 pups in tow. If she's really yours, why was she in that state?" The man simply shrugged, taking a step closer. "She escaped. It happens sometimes. But I'm here to take her back now." Michael's arm stiffened as he lifted his rifle, aiming directly at the man's chest. "She's not going anywhere with you. She's not yours to claim anymore." The man's smirk briefly wavered as he halted. "You don't understand what you're getting into, old man. That dog is trouble. She belongs with me." Michael's hold on his rifle grew firmer. "No, she needs to be with someone who cares. Now leave my property." Just then, Grace positioned herself in the doorway, her stance taut and her teeth exposed in a menacing growl. Her growl filled the crisp morning air, causing a hint of fear to wash over the man's face as his smirk completely disappeared. "Grace, get back," Michael commanded, but she remained immovable. Her gaze was fixed intensely on the man, and it dawned on Michael how deeply she recognized him. This wasn't some unknown threat. This was the person she had fled from, the one who had inflicted harm on her and her pups. Seeing Grace's reaction, the man retreated a step, his hand loosening around the rope, which then dropped to the ground. "You've made a mistake, old man," he stammered, a trace of fear creeping into his voice. "You don't understand what that dog's capable of." Michael took a cautious step forward, his rifle aimed and ready. "Your real mistake was thinking you could just waltz back here and take her. She's staying put, and so are her pups. Now leave my property before I force you to regret coming back." The intruder paused, his gaze darting between Michael and Grace, then slowly backed away, disappearing into the forest. Michael kept his eyes on the fading figure until he was sure the man was gone, his shoulders gradually relaxing. Once inside, Michael secured the door and knelt by Grace, who remained alert. "He's gone," he murmured gently, patting her head. "You did well, girl. You kept us safe." Grace exhaled a soft breath, her tension melting away as she leaned into Michael's comforting touch. Snow and ash, animated by the warmth, let out small yips that pierced the quiet. Michael gently lifted them and settled them next to Grace, who wrapped herself around them protectively. That evening, as the fire popped and hissed in the hearth, Michael sat close by with Grace and her pups. He was aware the man might return, yet he was confident Grace wouldn't flee. She had discovered her sanctuary, her family, and her bravery. In return, Michael had uncovered something unexpectedly vital, a reason to fight, guard, and cherish. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt profoundly alive. He and Grace had confronted the darkness together, and they would meet any future challenges side by side. Grace's transition from an icy doorstep to a cozy home was truly extraordinary. Her perseverance, her growing connection with Michael, and her steadfast care for her pups illustrated the profound effect of love and trust. Facing perils together, they moved beyond the dark chapters of Grace's past, showcasing that hope shines even in the bleakest moments. Stories like Grace's highlight the bravery of animals and their significant impact on our lives. Let this story move you to act. Consider adopting, supporting your local animal shelter, or simply sharing this video to raise awareness. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and pass it on to someone who cherishes tales of resilience and new beginnings. Together, we can change lives, one rescue at a time. Thank you for joining us on this inspiring journey.